In the wars of the late 19th and early 20th century, we can find hundreds and hundreds of devastating weapons, but among all of them, what stands out most is the recurring presence of the Maxim gun. This heavy, water-cooled machine with a relentless firing mechanism appeared in many of the era's conflicts, from its most famous killing fields like the trenches of World War I to the horrors of the Eastern Front of World War II. But something all of these encounters have in common is that the men who operated these guns almost never survived. So why was operating this weapon considered a death sentence, and what made the men behind it some of the most hated soldiers on every front? So firstly, let's start by understanding why the Maxim became so useful during combat, and why it had become so hated later on. As the First Battle of Ypres took place, the front turned into a stalemate, and all of a sudden, generals resorted to their old trusted methods that had been used during wars like the Franco-Prussian War, which was going over the top. This was intended as a strategy to quickly overwhelm the enemy forces with thousands of men storming the fortifications on the other side. However, there was one recent invention that these generals didn't account for: the Maxim gun. Now a few men could dish out thousands of rounds in the matter of a couple of minutes, which ended up with them stopping full-on assaults. However, the origins of the gun came far before World War I even started. When the American Civil War began, inventor Richard Jordan Gatling saw the sheer amount of people who lost their lives and was disgusted. So he went out to seek a solution, creating the famous Gatling gun that would later see limited use during the war. The idea behind it was that since it could do the work of 100 men, the armies would be reduced and less people would die. However, as we know now, that would be far from the case. The Gatling gun worked in a pretty simple way. It had multiple barrels arranged in a circle, and as you cranked it, the barrels rotated, so it could fire much faster than a single rifle. But while it looked and sounded terrifying, it wasn't technically full auto. However, it was the start, and this was where industrial warfare really began to change. In 1884, Hiram Maxim was watching a demonstration of automatic weapons, when someone reportedly told him, "If you want to make a lot of money, invent something that will enable Europeans to cut each other's throats more efficiently." So he did. Instead of relying on a man cranking a handle, Maxim designed a weapon that used its own recoil energy to reload itself. So once you fired a round and the gun kicked back, that backward motion ejects the spent casing, then loads a new round. And as long as you held the trigger and had ammunition feeding through the belt, the gun would keep firing. This would turn out to be the first true full auto gun. But the Maxim gun had one clear issue at the time: its heat system. So Maxim added something clever: a water cooling jacket around the barrel. All you had to do was pour water into a metal sleeve that surrounded it, keeping the weapon cold and ready to fire. And as long as the gun had sufficient water supply, which it did on the Western Front, it could keep cool almost forever. So the gun seemed extremely intuitive to the operators. But this is where it would take a far darker turn. At the Battle of the Somme, machine gunners went into it knowing the attack depended on them holding one narrow crossfire, and as the battle started, enemy officers could easily spot their location and inform the artillery crews nearby. While a rifleman could simply run away under pressure, a Maxim crew had to stay nearby to look for a potential assault. A single high explosive round landing within a few meters could wipe out the entire crew in an instant. But even a near miss could send shrapnel through the gaps in the emplacement, killing or wounding men who had no choice but to stay put. So they were stuck in this awful position where doing their job well was essentially what got them killed. But artillery wasn't even the worst of it. Instead, snipers became one of the most effective ways to deal with machine gun crews. Dedicated marksmen such as Canadian sniper Francis Pegamagabo were specifically trained to pick off gunners, and the way most Maxim type guns were set up made this really easy. The gunner had to sit or crouch directly behind the weapon, exposing them slightly from the front. So a skilled sniper, sometimes positioned hundreds of meters away, could put a round right through the gunner's head before anyone in the crew even heard the shot. And when the first gunner dropped, the second man simply had to take over immediately. So he'd push his dead crewmate aside, grab the handles and keep firing, knowing full well that the sniper was still watching. Some positions went through 3 or 4 gunners in a single engagement, and each man stepping up to the gun understood he was probably next. But at least with snipers and artillery, death was usually quick and painless. Trench raids, on the other hand, were a completely different story. These were small, fast attacks that happened mostly at night. A group of enemy soldiers, sometimes only 6 or 8 men, would crawl across no man's land with grenades and knives. Their primary objective in many of these raids was to knock out machine gun positions. And because the guns were loud and released a ton of steam, the raiding parties knew exactly where to go. So they tossed grenades into the emplacement first, then rush in and finish off anyone still alive. Most got stabbed or hit by knives or clubs, but sometimes they'd even use a flamethrower, completely roasting the crew alive. alive. The gunners who were trained to operate the Maxim were at a serious disadvantage in hand-to-hand combat, as that was far from their expertise. But somehow gas attacks were even worse because machine gun crews had a unique problem at the time. Their early gas masks were clumsy and restricted vision badly, and operating a Maxim gun required precise coordination between the whole team, from the gunner to the loader. But trying to do all of that while wearing a rubber mask that fogged up and made it hard to breathe slowed the process down by a lot. Some crews on the Eastern Front weren't even equipped with gas masks, such as the men defending the Osowiec fortress. So as German gas attacked them, they were forced to inhale it, causing some of the soldiers to literally cough up pieces of their lungs. The men would later get up half dead and man their machine guns to fire at the advancing Germans. On the other side, the German MG-08 crews on the Western Front dealt with all of these same problems, but they also faced a particular kind of psychological pressure. The British fired over 1.5 million shells in the week before the Somme, and those shells were aimed heavily at known machine gun positions. So German gunners had to sit in their bunkers for days, while an artillery shell could collapse the walls on top of them at any moment during a direct hit. But then, the moment the shelling stopped, they had to sprint to their guns and start firing before the enemy infantry ran across no man's land and into their trench. The M1916 37mm gun, on the other hand, completely terrified the Germans because the gun gave no warning like artillery did. It was known as the 1-pounder or the bunker buster, and that wasn't for no reason. An American or French soldier could use its telescopic sight and fire a shell directly at the crew from a safe distance, often completely obliterating the whole crew in an instant. But on the Eastern Front, the Russian PM-1910 crews faced a different kind of nightmare. Supply lines were unreliable, so ammunition and spare parts were constantly running short, and the M1910 was heavy, mounted on a wheeled carriage called the Sokolov that weighed around 45 kilograms on its own. So when Russian units were forced to retreat, which happened often, the crews had to either drag this massive weapon with them or destroy it so the enemy couldn't capture it, because abandoning the gun was considered a serious offense. So some troops literally died trying to drag it through mud and snow when they should have been running. But these men also posed an insane risk to their comrades. You see, if you were in a trench next to a Maxim position, you knew that position was going to attract artillery and raids, and you'd be caught in the middle of it. So gunners were often placed in separate emplacements away from the main trench line, which meant they had less support when things went south. The British Machine Gun Corps, formed in 1915, lost over 62,000 casualties by the end of the war. And out of roughly 170,000 men who served in the Corps, that's more than a third. The men who served in it kept using the nickname the Suicide Club straight through to 1918 for a reason. But as bad as World War I was, the Russians who operated the Maxim gun during the Russian Civil War somehow had it far worse. The Russian Civil War broke out in the late 1910s, and almost overnight, the country was at full-scale war. The Communist Red Army fought the White Army, but dozens of smaller factions were fighting their own wars at the same time. So here, Maxim crews found themselves in a situation where the rules of conventional warfare just didn't exist anymore. Both sides used the PMM-1910, but keeping them running was a constant struggle, because spare parts were almost non-existent, and in the middle of a Russian winter, the water inside the cooling jacket could freeze overnight. And when the barrel failed before a fight, it would usually take weeks for the replacement jacket to arrive at the front line. Now, this isn't really what this video is about, but I think it's still worth a quick mention. As the war progressed, both sides started mounting their Maxims on the back of horse-drawn carts called tachankas. These things had almost zero armor, and the gunner sat completely exposed while the cart charged straight at enemy lines at full speed. By 1919, Nestor Makhno's anarchist army alone had around 1,000 of them racing across southern Ukraine. But that wasn't even the real horrors for these men. It was what happened when they were captured. See, machine gunners in the Russian Civil War weren't treated like regular prisoners. Both sides saw them as the men who had mowed down waves of their comrades, and they wanted payback. So when a Maxim crew was overrun, they were almost always executed on the spot. Reports from both Red and White forces describe gunners being beaten to death by groups of soldiers, and some were mutilated before being killed as a warning to the enemy. So crews started destroying their weapons before surrendering, hoping they'd pass as a regular soldier. But it rarely worked, because their hands were burned and blistered from operating the gun, and their uniforms carried scorch marks and oil stains that gave them away immediately. But what made all of this even worse was that many of these gunners hadn't even chosen to be there. Both the Red and White armies relied heavily on conscription, so a farmer from some village could find himself behind a Maxim one week and dead the next, fighting for a cause he didn't understand. By the time the Civil War ended in 1922, somewhere between 7 and 12 million people had died across Russia, and the men behind the Maxim guns were among the least likely to have survived it. So when World War II came around, you'd think the Soviets would have learned to take better care of their machine gunners, but somehow, it only got worse. Now, before World War II even started, the Soviets already knew the Maxim was outdated, so in 1939 they tried replacing it with a brand new gun called the DS-39, designed by Degtyarev, and on paper, it looked like the solution to everything. It was air-cooled and more modern in every way, but when the Soviets invaded Finland in the Winter War that same year, the DS-39 completely fell apart. The return springs failed in the cold, and it ripped apart its own ammunition during feeding. So after making only about 10,000 of them, they went right back to making the old reliable Maxim M1910. So now the Soviets were heading into a world war with a machine gun designed before most of their soldiers' parents were even born. But this is where the Maxim proved why it always stayed in fashion. When Operation Barbarossa kicked off in June 1941, the German army smashed through Soviet lines so fast that entire units were wiped out in a few days. The average life expectancy of a Soviet reinforcement arriving in Stalingrad was measured in hours, and the Maxim crews were right in the middle of all of it. At the Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet defenders set up their Maxims inside the ruins of bombed-out factories and grain silos. The fighting was so close that soldiers in different rooms of the same building could hear each other breathing. And in places like the famous grain elevator, Maxim crews fired until the guns were completely destroyed and the men were out of ammo. But the biggest problem for Soviet Maxim crews in World War II wasn't the fighting itself. You see, Stalin had issued Order 227, which basically said, not one step backwards. And this applied to everyone, but machine gunners had it especially bad. If your unit retreated and you left your Maxim behind, that was considered a criminal offense. So just like in World War I, some crews had to choose between dying by their gun or being punished by their own army for abandoning it. And keep in mind, the gun plus its Sokolov mount still weighed well over 60 kilograms. Dragging it through rubble, mud, or snow while being shot at was almost impossible. So these gunners were trapped between the Germans in front of them and their own forces behind them. But somehow, the Maxim also had a strange advantage that kept it going far longer than it should have. Because here's the thing about Finland. During the Winter War and the Continuation War, both the Finns and the Soviets relied heavily on the Maxim. And in those freezing conditions, the water-cooled Maxim actually outperformed newer air-cooled guns. The Finns had even modified their version, the M32-33, with a large cap on top of the water jacket so crews could stuff handfuls of snow directly into it. The Soviets saw this, copied the idea, and started adding their own version of this tractor cap to their M1910s from around 1941 onward. So in Finland, where snow was basically unlimited, you had a free and endless supply of coolant sitting right next to you at all times. The MG42 was far superior on paper, firing at roughly 1,200 rounds per minute compared to the Maxim's 600, but in the extreme cold of the Finnish and Russian fronts, its faster rate of fire actually worked against it. It burned through barrels quickly, and the high rate of fire meant more stoppages in freezing conditions. So in one of the strangest twists of the war, soldiers in Finland sometimes preferred a gun from the 1880s over the most advanced machine gun of its era. But that didn't mean the Maxim crews were safe. Far from it, actually. However, by 1942, the Soviet military officially ordered the development of a replacement, and in May 1943, the SG-43 Goryunov was adopted. It was air-cooled and could be moved far more easily than the old Maxim. And here's an interesting detail. The man who designed it, Pyotr Goryunov, had actually served in the Red Army from 1918 to 1922. So he knew exactly what was wrong with the Maxim from personal experience. But even after the SG-43 was adopted, the Soviets couldn't just stop making Maxims overnight, and production didn't fully end until 1945. So throughout some of the bloodiest fighting on the Eastern Front, from Kursk to the push into Berlin, Soviet soldiers were still hauling around a gun that was older than their grandparents. But after the war, the Maxim somehow still stayed in use across the world. The Soviets first of all handed thousands of them off to communist allies in the Korean War, then in Vietnam, and even in conflicts across Africa and the Middle East. By the time the last Finnish Maxim M32-33 was finally taken out of reserve storage, it was the late 1990s, over 100 years after Hiram Maxim first built the thing. But believe it or not, the story didn't end there. Even now, in active conflicts in 2026, soldiers have pulled old M1910 Maxims out of storage and put them right back into service, sometimes fitted with modern optics and even suppressors. So a gun that was literally designed to cut down cavalry charges in the 1880s is still being fired over 140 years later. If you'd like to see another video on military history, let us know in the comments and leave a like.